Hey, how's it going? So, today's video for you in celebration of Easter Sunday is to talk about the resurrection story. Now, before I get into all of that, I want to lay some groundwork for those of you that don't know, just a little bit of New Testament history. So, I'm going to be referring to the books of John, Luke, Matthew, and Mark. And as far as the datings go, for most scholarly folks, they date them, Mark being around 70 AD, Matthew maybe a little bit later than that, Luke 80s, 85. So, some are all within a 10-year period. I mean, roughly around the same time. And John, I believe, was a little bit later in its datings. You can Wikipedia all this. You can look it up for yourself and find that the datings are right about where I'm saying they are. And if you've watched my other videos, you've heard this before. John was the last gospel that was written. So without further ado, don't want to waste a lot of time blathering on about all of that. But I'll go ahead and get into the good book here. And you see, I've got my Bad Religion. For some of you that don't know, it's a Southern California punk rock band from the 90s, 80s and 90s. And so I thought that was kind of fitting for my, Easter Sunday sermon here that I'm about to deliver from the good book. And so speaking of the good book, I'm actually reading from, this is a NIV, the New International Version, published by Zondervan. And some might say, well, it depends on the version you're reading from and yada, yada, yada. New American Standard, NIV, whatever. I mean, obviously the King James is going to be significantly different, but I think most Bibles, the story that we're going to hear about the resurrection, the account is going to be pretty much the same. I'm going to begin in the book of, I don't have this all tabbed out. I guess that would have probably been super helpful, just so we could get there relatively quickly. But starting with the book of Mark, because the book of Mark is the one by most scholars hold to be written before the other three. So we'll start with the book of Mark and find in here about the resurrection account. Now, I will say right off the bat, just looking at first glance of all the four Gospels, Mark is the first one written, but it's the smallest account. And if it starts in chapter 16, I'm sorry, is that right? Is it chapter 16? I do apologize. Like I said, I don't get to usually do this kind of thing. I'm just talking on the fly, and I don't have all my facts at my fingertips, but right now I do. So we're looking at the book of Mark, and this is chapter, 16, okay. It said Luke at the top of the page. It threw me off. Chapter 16, and it's verse 1. And it says the resurrection. So this is the account that Mark, the first gospel that was written, this is the account that Mark gives. And again, the Gospel of Mark is anonymous. We don't know. All of the Gospels are anonymous, so we don't know who wrote these things. I mean, many people try to say, oh, it was, Luke was, what was it, the physician of Jesus or something like that, and there was the other one, the disciple that Jesus loved or whatever. And but we don't know. We don't really know. They're anonymous. They're not eyewitness accounts. Many Christians believe they are. And so what you're going to see here in Mark is that this is the smallest of the accounts. And by the time we get to John, it's going to be super, super elaborate. I mean, it's going to be like several paragraphs worth of stuff. In this Mark's version, we only get like really 2, maybe 3 paragraphs of information on the resurrection. By the time we get to John's gospel, it's extensive. I mean, you're talking like maybe, 10, 12 paragraphs. Quite interesting for someone that's the farthest removed, but we'll get to that in a minute. And one thing I might also want to say to this is, because there's an extensive amount of information to be covered, I'm going to be reading from the actual chapters, just so you can compare it for your own. I probably might have to, depending on how quickly I can get through this, I might have to do a part 1, part 2, so bear with me. I'll see how quickly we can get through it. As long as I stop blathering and talking and get into it, we can find out what it's all about. All right, so Mark 16, verse 1, the resurrection. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and I think it's Salome, bought spices so they might go to anoint Jesus' body. Very early on, the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb, and they asked each other, who will roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb? Obviously a rather large stone, and so that kind of makes sense. But when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. Now, it's important to pay attention to all these details. This is the first gospel that was ever written that is supposed to be giving an eyewitness, not an eyewitness account, but supposed to be giving an account that this is a historical event. But watch how they differ, and that's what I want you to pay close attention to. Okay, so the women were alarmed. And then the young man that was there, presumably maybe an angel or something, said, "Do not be alarmed." He said, "You are looking for Jesus, the Nazarene, who was crucified. He is risen. He is not here. The place where they laid is not here, and at the place, see the place where they had laid him. But go tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. Now that's the end of the original manuscripts, and that's all that was ever written in the original manuscripts. And that's what the little footnote says here. The earliest manuscripts and some other ancient witnesses, whoever they were, do not have Mark 16:9 through 20. Well, why is that? We don't know. Maybe they got lost. So this next section here, verses 9 through 20, basically were not in the original manuscript. And in my opinion, and probably many other scholars, this is something that is added on, maybe an interpolation or whatever. This is stuff they added in after the fact. Maybe not. Maybe they just lost it. But if it's saying the earliest manuscripts don't have 16 through 20, which I'm about to read, why is that? It's rather suspect. What does 16 through 19 say? 16 through 20 say, "When Jesus rose early on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, out of whom he had driven 7 demons. She went and told those who had been with him and who were mourning and weeping when they heard that Jesus was alive and that he had seen them. They did not believe it." So the disciples didn't believe it after the women told them. And that's called, is it the swoons theory? I think it's where they said that, the embarrassment clause, because they say that women's testimonies could not be reliable. So if the women were giving testimony, that brings credence to it. I mean, it's creditable because, women's testimonies couldn't be trusted. And so obviously if they were to believe this, then it must have really happened. Well, anyways. Afterwards, Jesus appeared in a different form to 2 of them while they were walking in the country. These returned, meaning these 2 people, reported it to the rest of them and did not believe, and I guess the disciples did not believe them either. Later, Jesus appeared to the 11 as they were eating. He rebuked them for their lack of faith and their stubborn refusal to believe those who had seen him after he had risen. Which, I'll pause right there for a second. If this was what was expected to have happened to the coming Messiah, then why would everyone have been so shocked? Why wouldn't, at the time of the crucifixion, why? I'm obviously, understandably, Mary, the mother of Jesus, would have wept, but all his followers, it was a very somber occasion. But if this should have been a time for them to shout Hosanna in the highest and celebrate, because they knew that this was what the Messiah came to do. But yet that's not the impression that we get from the crucifixion scene. During the resurrection scene, they're just like all in shock that, like, oh my gosh, this great rabbi, this great teacher is now dead. But yet if they were expecting him to come back I don't know. I'm just saying, if I was living back then, maybe you were living back then, and Jesus told us, hey, I'm coming back in 3 days, don't worry, I'm going to raise again, they began to doubt. I guess that's a normal expectation to have. It seems kind of like if this is what was taught through the prophets in the Old Testament, and this is what their expectations could have been for the coming Messiah, there shouldn't have been all this weeping and worrying about it. He's coming back. He said he would. Either you trust he's the Messiah and he's the Redeemer, or he's not. So you see that it's the storytelling is really strange. Later, we talked about that. He said to them, obviously the disciples, "Go into all the world and preach the good news to all creation. Whoever believes and is baptized will be saved, but whoever does not will be condemned. And these signs will accompany those who believe. In my name they will drive out demons. They will speak in new tongues. They will pick up snakes with their hands. And when they drink deadly poison, it will not hurt them at all. They will place their hands on the sick, on sick people, and they will get well." And I guess that's all Pentecostalism and gets its thing from they can do the dancing with poisonous snakes, and seems like you're tempting fate, huh? It's what it seems to me. After the Lord had spoken to them, he was taken up into heaven, and he sat at the right hand of God. Then the disciples went out and preached everywhere, and the Lord worked with them and confirmed his word by the signs that accompanied it. Now, that's all we have. But you're going to see in the coming chapters and the books that I'm going to read from on the resurrection how much it builds on that and expounds, and how the accounts differ. And we'll go ahead and get that right into that now. So we're going to jump over to the next gospel that was written, which was the Gospel of Matthew, which Matthew appears, of course, first in the New Testament Bible, but was actually not written before Mark. But it's placed there probably because it was the most beloved gospel of all the New Testament Gospels. It was the one that was probably preferred the most. All right. Matthew's version of the resurrection, again, 2 to 3 paragraphs, just like Mark. Very small, not much to it. And it states, after the Sabbath, at the dawn of the first day of the week, okay, with the timings generally the same, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to look at the tomb. Now, what's different about Mark's version versus Matthew's? Well, he excluded some people, but again, okay, he just didn't feel it necessary to include them. I don't know. But Matthew goes on to include an interesting detail, if this is a historical event, that was not mentioned in the book of Mark. Mark did not mention, but Matthew does, in verse 2, chapter 28, verse 2, there was a violent earthquake, for an angel of the Lord came down from heaven, going to the tomb, and rolled back the stone and sat on it. How does Matthew know that? If Mark didn't know that, does Matthew have an access to some source of document that maybe Mark didn't? But if Mark wrote before Matthew, why would we see, as we're going to see in the coming books that we read on the resurrection, why would they be including things that were at least not in the first one? You say, well, maybe Mark just didn't know it. Maybe he wasn't privy to that information. Maybe, or maybe they're just embellishing the hell out of this story. Let's continue. This is chapter 28, verse 3. His appearance in the book of Matthew. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothes were white as snow. The guards were so afraid of him, they shook and became like dead men. Okay, where does he get these details from? The angel said to the women, do not be afraid. Now, okay, in the Mark's version, the angel said to the women, do not be afraid. Okay, so that's consistent. There was an angel supposedly at the tomb. So we can say they're kind of cross-check each other there. He says, the angel had said, for I know that you are looking for Jesus who was crucified. He is not here, he is risen. All right, just as he said he would. And that's pretty much the same as Mark, okay. Come and see the place where he lay, where they had laid him. Then go quickly and tell his disciples, he is risen from the dead and going ahead of you into Galilee, and there you will see him. Now I have told you. So the women hurried away from the tomb, afraid yet filled with joy, and ran to tell his disciples. But this event takes place in Matthew that does not take place in Mark, and I wonder why, if it's really a historical event. And I'll ask that question later on the other Gospels too. Suddenly Jesus met them. Greetings, he said. They came to him, clasped his feet, and worshipped him. Then Jesus said to them, do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee. There they will see me. Okay, all right. Well, anyways, that's the account of Matthew. Now it goes into talking about, it continues a little bit more. The guards report. While the women were on their way, some of the guards went into the city and reported to the chief priest everything that had happened. When the chief priest had met with the elders and devised a plan, they gave the soldiers a large sum of money, telling them, you are to say his disciples came during the night and stole him away while we were asleep. If this report gets to the governor, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble. So the soldiers took the money and did as they were instructed, and this story has been widely circulated among Jews to this very day. Why does this account, if it really happened, not appear in Mark? Okay? You know what I mean? It's like, where is Matthew getting his information from? If Mark was written first, why is it not in there? The Great Commission. Then the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountains where Jesus had told them to go when they saw him. They worshipped him, but some doubted. Then Jesus came to them and said, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore go make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I am with you always to the very end of the age. Okay, so now we've only covered Mark and we've covered Matthew. And Is it like, oh my gosh, so drastically different? Well, I mean, it's a little bit different in terms of its accounting and this interesting new developments, this interesting alleged events and dialogue that appears in Matthew that doesn't appear in Mark. And why is that? I mean, if Mark's written again before, okay, so let's continue on, because what you're going to see now in Luke and John is that it continues to build on alleged events that we don't hear anything about in Matthew and Mark. So let's jump over to Luke and get Luke's version of the resurrection. And at this point, you may say, oh, well, I don't see it's that drastically different. It's still a story about the resurrection. But if it's a historical event, the key details we should be able to see are consistently say, well, overall, it's generally the same story, and it's fairly consistent. So I see no problem with that. Well, as you're going to see here in Luke and John, the story is going to take off and quite extensively. The resurrection. This is chapter 24. It's quite a few paragraphs long. I'll do as best I can to read it as quickly as I can and get through it. But this is chapter 24, verse 1 of Luke. And it says, on the first day of the week, very early in the morning. Okay, at least the timing is consistent. The women took spices they had prepared. Okay, that's consistent to Mark. Prepared and went to the tomb. All right, that's the same. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb. Okay. But it doesn't say that they entered. I mean, you go back to what Mark said and what Matthew said, the sequencing is different. But they said the women entered the tomb, and it doesn't say that in Matthew and Mark. It doesn't say they entered the tomb, but in Luke it says, but when they entered, they did not find the body of Jesus. While they were wondering about this, suddenly 2 men in clothes and that gleamed like lightning stood beside him. Okay, the description of the men is identical, but in Matthew and Luke, there are 2 men. In Mark, there was only 1. I'm just saying, you got to get the story straight. If there were 2 angels, there were 2 angels. If there was only 1, why does Mark, if he's accounting for history, why is there only one angel there? In their fright, the women bowed down to their faces, to the ground. But the men said to them, why do you look for the living among the dead? That's not what we read in Mark, and it's not what we read in Matthew. And that sequence event didn't take place. He is not here. He has risen. So I'm just saying, if Matthew and Mark wrote before Luke, where is Luke getting this dialogue from? Where is he getting these conversations if he's actually accounting for history? Because if it's a real historical event, certainly the writers that wrote before the Gospel of Luke should have had the same dialogue, right? I'm just saying. I'm just asking the questions. It makes sense to me. But he says, why do you look for the living among the dead? That was never said in Matthew or Mark. He is not here. He has risen. Okay, they did say that. Remember how he told you while you were still with him in Galilee, the Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men, be crucified on the 3rd day, be risen again. And then they remembered his words. Well, that never was mentioned in Matthew or Mark. Verse 9, when they came back from the tomb, they told all these things to the 11 and to all the others. It was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the others who told this to the apostles. But they did not believe the women because their words seemed like nonsense. But how could it seem like nonsense that they're saying the Lord Jesus Christ is risen? If this was what the messianic expectations were, if they expected Jesus to be resurrected, how could it sound like nonsense when they said, oh, this is what we expected to happen? He said he would come back to life. He would raise again on the 3rd day. But yet they're dumb. It makes no sense at all. How could he just days earlier have communicated this to them? And I get this. This is one thing that Christians go and say, oh, this is what makes the story believable, is how doofus sounding these disciples were. But it makes no sense. It's not just them. Not only were the disciples aware of this, but every other Jew living would have known that the Redeemer that was coming, that the Messiah that was coming, this was what the expectation was. If Jesus was truly the suffering servant, and it was not a metaphor for Israel, like I think it was, the Israel was the suffering servant, not Jesus. If you read it in its proper context, then they would have known that the Messiah was not supposed to die. Anyways, but they did not believe the women because it seemed like nonsense. Peter, however, got up and ran to the tomb. Bending over, he saw the strips of linen laying by themselves, and he went away, wondering to himself what had happened. Okay, well, we didn't get that account in the first 2 Gospels, Matthew and Mark. All right, on the road to Emmaus, I think is how you say it. Now, that day, 2 of them were going into the village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking with each other about everything that had happened. They talked and discussed these things with each other. And then Jesus himself came up to them and walked alongside of them, but they were kept from recognizing. Why would Jesus keep the disciples from recognizing him? I mean, is he playing mind games? What's going on here? Anyways, they didn't realize it was Jesus. And Jesus said to them, what are you guys discussing? What are you two walking along? What are you guys talking about? And so they stood there still, their faces downcast, and one of them, so why are they downcast? I get that their Messiah, their great teacher, the great rabbi, is now dead, but if they were expecting him to come back to life, they shouldn't be downcast. This is what they expected to happen, right? One of them, named Cleopas, asked him, are you only a visitor to Jerusalem? Basically, come on, man. Have you not heard about the crucifixion? Have you not heard about what's going on? And Jesus says, what things, he asked. About Jesus of Nazareth, they replied. He was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all people. Anyways, the chief priests, they go through explaining it and yada, 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 talking about what had happened. And explaining that, then some of his companions went to, so just kind of bringing Jesus up to speed on what basically you find in the Gospel of Mark and Matthew, and then what we just previously read in the first part of Luke. So, and in the beginning, with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in the scriptures concerning himself. So if Moses and the prophets and everything were foretelling of Jesus and what he needed to do, then why would they be so dumbfounded that he was now been crucified and died? That makes no sense. As they approached the village to which they were going, Jesus acted as if he were going to go further. But then they urged him to stay, and they said, stay with us. And then they broke bread, and then they got together. And eventually, once he broke bread with them, then their eyes were open. Like magically, they realized all of a sudden who he was. And it's just, you realize that this is a fairy tale. I could go on and keep reading that this is just, but it's just made up. They asked each other, were not our hearts burning within? It's just like, it's just a great story. It's not... as it goes on for a little bit, they got up and they returned once to Jerusalem, and they found the 11, and they assembled, and they said, hey, it is true, the Lord is risen, and he has appeared to Simon. And anyways, it goes on and on and on with all this dialogue that we don't see in Matthew, we don't see in Mark. Why is that? So Luke has got all this stuff, access to some other records that they didn't. It's an oral tradition. If it was an oral tradition passed down, then Mark and Matthew would have had it in their gospel, but we don't see any of this. So it goes on a little bit more and talks about Jesus appears to the disciples, and it accounts for it. So what are we supposed to surmise? That Mark and Matthew gave a condensed version of it, but Luke felt inclined to embellish and write more? Yeah, probably. Totally on the embellishment side. While they were still talking about Jesus, about this, Jesus himself stood among them and said, peace be with you. Boy, this sounds like Catholicism, doesn't it? That's probably where they got it from, right? The peace be with you thing with Catholics. They were startled and frightened and thinking that they saw a ghost. And he said to them, why are you troubled? And why do doubts rise in your minds? Look at my hands and feet. It is I. Touch me and see. It's not a ghost, but it's flesh and bones, and as you see. Okay, so I guess Jesus hadn't ascended to heaven and gotten his celestial body yet. I guess the ascension is coming. So think about this. I mean, he's been sitting in the grave for 3 days and bleeding, and he must stinketh by this point. But none of that's mentioned. Like, Jesus, he reeks, man. Reeks of death. I mean, the guy was crucified. If you've seen the story, the Passion of Christ, with Mel Gibson, I mean, it's pretty brutal. And yet he's walking around. So anyway, this is the comical part. When he said this, he showed them his hands and feet, and while they still did not believe it because of joy and amazement, he asked them, do you have anything to eat around here? It basically says that, do you have anything to eat? So basically the Messiah was hungry after being in the ground for 3 days, and now he's hungrier than hell, and he's ready to, it's just funny that, he's the Messiah. He's God's, supernatural power. Why does he need to have earthly, it just seems comical that, the Son of God would need to eat. But he hasn't ascended into his celestial body. I get it. That's what Christians are going to say. Anyways, so they gave him boiled fish. Broiled fish, I'm sorry. And they took it and they ate it in his presence. Anyways, he said to them, this is what I told you while I was still with you. Everything must be fulfilled that is written about me in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms. Right. Why are they so thick-headed and they can't believe it? But they were. I don't know. We don't have an explanation for that. But it makes no sense to me that it wouldn't have only been the disciples that were expecting the Messiah to come and die, if that's what was really supposed to happen. But it would have been every other living Jew would have expected this, and this would have been common knowledge, common expectations. But it wasn't. The way their reactions are, they're dumbfounded. They can't understand, why and now he's back and they're still in shock and disbelief. I mean, I get that part, but if this was what was told to him, they shouldn't be as shocked and surprised as they are, if this is a true story. Anyways, then he opened their minds so they could understand the scriptures. He told them, this is what is written, that Christ will suffer and rise on the dead the third day, and the repentance and forgiveness of sins will be preached in his name to all nations, beginning at Jerusalem. You are witnesses of these things. I'm going to send you what my Father has promised, but stay in the city until you have been clothed with the power from on high. Okay. Then it talks about the ascension. It says, when he had led them out of the vicinity of Bethany, he lifted up his hands and blessed them, and while he was blessing them, he left them and was taken up into heaven. And then they worshipped him and returned to Jerusalem with great joy, and they stayed continually at the temple praising God. So that's the ascension. So that is way more than what we read about in the book of Mark and in the Gospel of Matthew. Way more. And I skipped over a lot of stuff. So like, where did all that dialogue come from? Where does it? Well, obviously they probably just made it up. They just embellished and fabricated it stuff. But again, even in John, I'm flipping through here, it looks like in chapter 12, verse 20, it talks about Jesus predicting his death. So it's not like, if it's a true historical event, Jesus didn't tell them what was supposed to happen, but yet they act so shocked afterwards. It's amazing to me. I'm like, what? How can this be? All right, so now we've come to the last gospel, the Gospel of John. And again, it's the same kind of thing. It builds upon what was written previously. Okay, Mark had his gospel, Luke had his gospel, and Matthew had his gospel, and now John's going to turn at taking a stab at this and building up the story even more and embellishing. So, all right, we're going to skip over the burial part of Jesus, and we're going to talk about just the empty tomb. I see time's getting a little bit long. I'll try to get through this as best as I can. The empty tomb, chapter 20 of John. Early on the first day of the week, okay, that's the same. While it was still dark, all right, added a little bit more detail. Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. Okay, John has left out, and I don't know why. Again, if this is a count, keep all the key players there. When there's an accident involving two cars, was it one car, two cars, three cars? I mean, what were the people who, you know what I mean? And I get the excuse for Christians is, well, people can't always recall, and this has been studied, that people can't always recall what was the color of the one car. I don't remember, I think it was it. So sometimes the details are a little bit fuzzy. But you have to remember about the Gospels, this was God breathed and inspired through men to write, okay? So God had his hand over the writing of this, allegedly. If he did, what accounts for the disparity? Now, I'm sure Christian apologists have explanations for why there's the disparity between the gospel, and maybe they see no issue with it. I see significant issues with it, but let's get back into it. So Mary Magdalene was supposedly, it says here, went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been, removed from the entrance. So she came running to Simon Peter. But that's not what, in the previous gospels, the three synoptics, that's not how it was accounted for. Remember, go back and look it for yourself and see what does it actually say. That's not how it was. Did they go to the tomb? Did they run back? This is not matching, identical. The timelines are not the same. So she says she was running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one who Jesus loved, and said, they have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have put him. Why would they think that he'd been taken out of the tomb? I mean, I guess because the body was missing. He told them that he was going to be resurrected. He was going to, go. He spoke to, and I don't get it. So Peter and the other disciple started from the tomb. Both were running, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He went over and looked at the strips of linen that were laying there, but did not go in. None of this appears in the prior Gospels that I just read to you. None of this. Then Simon Peter, who was behind him, arrived and went into the tomb. It's just a different version. He saw the strips of linen laying there, as well as the burial cloth that had been around Jesus' head. Oh, the Shroud of Turin. We found out that was a bunch of BS. The cloth was folded up by itself, separate from the linen. Well, at least Jesus is a tidy person, right? He makes his bed up and cleans up the area before he departs. That's pretty cool. Finally, the other disciple who had reached the tomb also went inside. He saw and believed. Now, they still did not understand from the scripture that Jesus had raised from the dead. One might account and say, well, this is just John's accounting at a different timeline, at a different sequence. But again, we're getting different information from different people. So what did they just pick and choose? What aspects of the story they wanted to tell? I mean, maybe, but it seems to me that it's clearly different. Jesus appears to Mary Magdalene. So you can see that John's accounting, the timelining, well, overall it's still the same story, and that's what they would say. I think it differs on some key points. I think the timelining and the sequencing, the dialogue, I think is all completely different. Jesus appears to Mary Magdalene. Then the disciples went back to their homes, but Mary stood outside the tomb crying. Okay, well, that's not the way the first three Gospels accounted for it. It says Mary shows up, then she runs back. In this account here, I mean, it did say that Mary went to the tomb first and saw that the stone had been rolling back. But there's more. The story is building. You can see that they're adding greater detail. And it's like, you got to remember, John was written, what, 90 to 100 AD? So maybe 70 years after the crucifixion. But yet, we've got all this detail, verbatim. Well, it's an oral tradition that was passed down. And I guess it's like playing the telephone game. Hey, so-and-so says this. You ever done that? When you get down about 10 people, the story changes. So, very well could have been an oral tradition, but it may not have been something that was an actual historical event. All right, back to Mary Magdalene. Then the disciples went back to the tomb, and Mary Magdalene stood outside the tomb crying. As she wept, she looked into the tomb and saw two angels in white. Okay, well, that matches up. That's what we saw. It's just the sequencing, the way John's telling his story. Okay, this would match Luke's, but it wouldn't match Mark's. Mark said there was only one angel seated there where Jesus' body had been, one at the head and one at the foot. And they asked the woman. Now again, this dialogue doesn't appear in any of the other Gospels. Woman, why are you crying? They have taken my Lord away. Who has taken my Lord? I'm thinking, does she not know that this is what he told her needed to happen? Why would she be so concerned for the whereabouts of Jesus? She think his body was who knows? We don't know. I'm speculating. So they have taken my Lord away, she said, and I don't know where they have put him. At this, she turned around, and then, standing there in front of her was Jesus. But she did not recognize it was Jesus. Again, he's got some kind of cloaking device that allows him to, like the Klingons in Star Trek, And so the disciples and the people were there, none of them could tell that it was him because he was incognito. It's just kind of like, what? Anyways, so then Jesus was standing there. She didn't realize it. And Jesus says, woman, why are you crying? Who is it that you're looking for? And of course, she thinks he's the gardener. Apparently, he didn't look the same after the crucifixion. But he hasn't had a transformed body because he hasn't had the ascension yet. So how could she not recognize him? I mean, obviously, if he's been beaten to a pulp, I get it. If that story was true about the crucifixion, it's a pretty brutal thing. But clearly, he would have seen the body that was on the cross. So how could she not? If he's not. Is he in transformation, like a metamorphosis, like a butterfly to caterpillar to a butterfly cocoon thing going on? I mean, it's just goofy. So it's basically, she says, thinking that he was the gardener, says, sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will get him. And Jesus said to her, Mary. And she turned around, cried out, and said in Aramaic, I think it's Rabboni, which means teacher. Jesus was considered to be a great teacher and a great rabbi. And why don't we have this dialogue in the earlier manuscripts of, like, Mark, Matthew, and Luke is my point. If this is a historical event, why is there dialogue not appearing until we get 70 years later that is not included in the earliest book written, the book of Mark? It was like 3 paragraphs. That's it. And it didn't contain any of this dialogue. Now, that doesn't mean it's a smoking gun. It's not true. But one would think that the writer, the gospel that was written to the closest to the time of Jesus, we would have this kind of dialogue. It wouldn't show up, these kind of conversations. And where is John getting his information? Maybe it's from the Q source. Maybe it's from this. Maybe it's from that. But clearly, he's just embellishing. I mean, because if he has this information, clearly the writers that came before him, is my point, should have had the same information. I'm just thinking here. Maybe, Okay, so Jesus said, do not hold on to me, for I have not yet returned to the Father, and go instead to my brothers and tell them, I am returning to my Father and to God, your God in heaven, whatever. And Mary Magdalene then went to the disciples with the good news, and I have seen the Lord, and she told them that she had seen all these things. Now Jesus appears to the disciples. On the evening of that day, the first day of the week, when the disciples were together with the doors locked for fear of the Jews, Jesus came and stood among them and said, peace be with you again. Oh, Catholics again. All right. After he said this, he showed them his hands and side. The disciples were overjoyed when they saw him. I mean, it's like, why are we not getting this kind of account? If this is something that really happened, Mark should have written about it. Matthew should have written about it to this great extent, and they don't. They did. I mean, you see there's like little condensed versions, but when John decided to write the resurrection story, I mean, he just went hog wild, is what it appears to me. Maybe it appears to you to be the same way. Again, Jesus said, peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, I am sending you. And he breathed on them. Boy, his breath must have stank, huh? If he'd been in the ground for 3 days and he's rotting. Just a thought, and he receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive anyone his sins, they are forgiven. If you do not forgive them, they are not forgiven. Which kind of makes no sense, because God's the one that chooses to forgive you of your transgressions, not anyone that receives the Holy Spirit. So I never really quite understand that. Maybe you understand and have a different take on it. All right. Jesus appears to Thomas. Now, I'm going to spare you all this because the time is getting great, but it basically goes into talking about how Jesus appeared to the doubting Thomas. Why is the doubting Thomas story, if this was a historical event, not included in the Synoptic Gospels? Why is it not in Mark, Matthew, or Luke? Doesn't appear. But John got it from somewhere. Clearly, if it was a historical event, the other three writers, at least one of the three writers, should have been able to include it in their accounting of a historical event. And I think the reason it's not there is because it's not a historical event. These are just great story writers telling you a great story. And then it talks about, let's see, no, I think that's it. That was basically chapter 20, verse 24 to verse 30. Discusses the doubting Thomas situation. So I'll go ahead and conclude with that because I know it's a bit long. But hopefully, through all my rambling, you've been able to see. I wish I had a chart that would show a side-by-side comparison of the differences. Because I know Christians are going to say, well, it's mostly consistent, but you go line by line, and it differs. And if it's a historical event, well, overall, the story is mostly true. Yeah, okay, it's mostly a story true about the resurrection of a man who was crucified, but the accounting of the dialogue, the sequencing of events doesn't match. So, well, maybe they just got it wrong on the sequencing. Okay, did they get the dialogue wrong? I mean, where does the writer who wrote John 70 years after the crucifixion, where does he get his information? And why did the first, like I said before, the first three not have it? All right, so I don't want to keep repeating myself, but I wanted to give you guys further clear concrete examples of what's in here in the Bible to show you I'm not just blowing smoke. I mean, this stuff, and obviously people like, this is the book I'm reading by Dr. Price, The Incredible Shrinking Son of Man, and other skeptics out there of the Bible, that it's not just hogwash. There is some legitimate basis. Now, some of you might listen to this and say, I don't really see much of an issue here with what you read, the argument. They might differ in some, but that's, whatever they might differ, that's acceptable. We can allow for that. There's some little tolerance there for them to differ. I mean, it seems to me that the arguments that I've raised throughout this video are pretty conclusive, that the gospel accounts differ, and that they would not, my presupposition, my presumption is that the gospel accounts would not differ. And especially they would not be like 10 to 12 paragraphs long in John and only 2 to 3 in Mark and Matthew, and then Luke, it starts to get a little bigger. And by the time we get to John, I mean, you can tell that they're just embellishing the story. I don't know that, but that seems to be what the evidence supports, because Mark, if he's the first writer who's the closest to the time of Jesus, he should have included that. Not to mention the fact that Paul, in all his epistles, doesn't even cover the stuff that's in the Gospels, doesn't even go into the life. Well, that wasn't his purpose, Christians will say. That wasn't his mission. He wasn't commissioned to do that. What, he was only commissioned to write to the churches and Philippians and Galatians and all this, and Thessalonians? I mean, that's it? I mean, he couldn't have talked about, well, you remember when the Lord Jesus appeared to the disciples. It's like he doesn't mention any of that stuff. It's like he has knowledge of the crucifixion, but none of the details, Paul I'm talking about, but none of the details like we read in the Gospels. And I think it's just folklore. I think it's myth and legend and ancient storytelling, and that's all it is. There's nothing more to it than that. Again, I don't know that. I can only suggest that, but I think the evidence supports that's what we're dealing with here, is just another ancient religion, claiming exclusivity to God, just like the Jews did. They were the chosen people, and that Christians morphed out of Judaism. And, that's what they were. Early Christians were Jews. So anyways, I'll conclude because I know the video's a bit long. If you've made it this long, I appreciate you checking it out. I hope that you got something out of it. I feel like I've been able to present you with some solid facts from the Bible that show where the gospel accounts differ from one another. All right, happy Easter. We'll see you next time.